Released exclusively in Japan in 1998, Arcade Gears Volume 2 brings together two of Irem's most iconic shoot-'em-ups, Image Fight and X Multiply. Published by Shing Entertainment, this compilation for PlayStation and Saturn aimed to give a second life to arcade titles that had never seen home console ports, Image Fight being something of an exception, with earlier versions on Famicom and PC Engine. Still, these compilations were an attempt to give these games the recognition they deserved. Today, let's turn our attention to X Multiply, which can be described in simple terms as a more organic, twisted variation on the famous R-Type formula. X Multiply is one of those Irem gems that flew under the radar, both at launch and long after. From the moment the title screen fades in, you know there's something unusual going on. X Multiply isn't just another shooter. People often compare it to R-Type, and fair enough, the similarities are there. But despite those shared roots, X Multiply carves out its own identity through both its world and its mechanics. Digging through old Japanese boards, I found that for the few who experienced it back in the day, X Multiply left a lasting impression. Not only thanks to its unusual aesthetics, but also for its unconventional gameplay. Some even go as far as calling it the real sequel to R-Type. And that starts to make sense when you remember how R-Type 2, released the same year after a long wait, disappointed many fans with its lack of innovation. And yet, despite this late praise, X Multiply remained in the shadows of Irem's bigger names. According to player accounts from the time, it was often relegated to 1 or 2 machines in arcades, and when it was there, hardly anyone touched it. Why? Well, several factors are at play, but a major one seems to be Irem's bizarre policy of withholding information, not just for X Multiply, but also for R-Type 2 and Dragon Breed. Irem actively avoided promoting their games pre-release, a tactic that might make sense for luxury goods, but not for arcade titles, where lifespans are short and competition is brutal. Even after launch, Irem remained strangely silent. One Gamist article lamented that the company had only brought 2 cabinets to a major Osaka expo. This lack of visibility stood in stark contrast to the extensive media push behind R-Type and Image Fight. Back then, Gamist ran in-depth guides and analyses, helping players understand Irem's often complex gameplay systems. That kind of information was key. It boosted strategy, encouraged discussion, and built communities. It's a big part of why R-Type became a cult classic. But suddenly, Irem stopped supplying info to Gamist. Articles vanished, strategy guides dried up, and X Multiply was one of the games that suffered the most. The result? Arcade operators ignored it. When it was available, players didn't know how to approach it, and in a pre-internet world, no guide meant no chance. In arcades, X Multiply quietly faded away. But let's talk about one of the most memorable parts of the game, its setting. The story centers around an alien parasite infecting a human host, and based on the background elements, that host appears to be a woman. So yes, there are some subtle and not so subtle erotic undertones throughout. To eliminate the threat, scientists shrink a spaceship and inject it directly into the infected body, a clear nod to Fantastic Voyage. This setup explains the game's visceral, organic environments. Unlike R-Type, where Giger-style biomechanical elements dominate, X Multiply goes full biological, squirming creatures, pulsing textures, fleshy membranes. Everything feels alive. Musically, the game stands out even more. The OST is fantastic, easily one of the main reasons I stuck with it. Synth-heavy and atmospheric, it captures a tense sci-fi tone beautifully. Better still, it evolves within stages. Stage 3's track, for instance, builds a level of tension rarely matched in the genre. Now onto the PS1 version, and it's a mixed bag. On the bright side, it's mostly faithful to the arcade version in terms of content. The assets, patterns, and pacing are close. Not identical, but close. The downside? The resolution takes a hit. Coming from the arcade original, the PS1 screen feels cramped, mainly due to a huge HUD that eats up space. Thankfully, as you'll see in the footage, it can be turned off, and it absolutely should be. Also, contrary to what Hardcore Gaming 101 claims, the Saturn version doesn't have lower resolution than the PS1 one. If anything, it's the other way around, making the Saturn version slightly more comfortable to play, though it's less accurate in terms of enemy patterns. But X Multiply isn't just about aesthetics. Its gameplay centers on a single, brilliant mechanic: tentacles. A well-documented love story in Japanese pop culture. X Multiply replaces R-Type's force module with two long, flowing tentacles that extend from your ship's sides. These aren't static, they respond dynamically to your movement, serving as both offense and defense. Mastering them takes time, and honestly, your survival hinges more on how you control them than on memorizing enemy patterns. Move vertically, and the tentacles stretch up and down, forming a wide attack range, almost like a trident. They also deal contact damage, letting you sweep enemies up close. Move horizontally, and their shape changes. Moving backward tightens them into a frontal shield. Moving forward tucks them behind you, protecting your rear. With the right rhythm, you can alternate movements and use the tentacles like windshield wipers, sweeping enemy bullets in real time. In some cases, that's the only way to survive. Unlike the force pod in R-Type, which can be fixed in place, these tentacles never stop moving. Shielding effectively requires pulling back just enough to shape them properly. A subtle organic system that demands finesse. And yes, X Multiply is hard, but not quite in the same way R-Type is. I'd argue it allows a bit more freedom and improvisation. Thanks to the tentacles, skilled players can react dynamically, weaving through dense bullet patterns with more control. The game also doesn't punish aggressive forward positioning in the scrolling, meaning you can take the fight to enemies without always hugging the left edge. But positioning still matters. Most threats emerge from the center of the screen, not the sides. Fall behind and the screen fills with projectiles fast. That said, the game's 3 weapons, laser, homing shots, and a spread gun, are unbalanced. Only the laser really holds up. Another parallel with R-Type, this is as much a puzzle game as it is a shooter. Success comes from reading enemy and boss patterns precisely. Classic genre mechanics apply. One-hit deaths. No shields. Brutal checkpoint system. Restarting late stages without power-ups is borderline masochistic. Level design and difficulty curve mirror R-Type too. Stages 1 to 3 are manageable, but stage 4 ramps things up hard. Some stages even echo specific R-Type levels. Stage 2, with its massive enemy ship, clearly nods to R-Type Stage 3. Stage 4 introduces moving environmental hazards that force pixel-perfect navigation, very R-Type 2, Stage 5. Sadly, PS1 controls lack a bit of precision. Grab a speed-up power-up and the ship starts to jerk unpredictably. From Stage 4 onward, I highly recommend collecting speed downs just to stay in control. The game also has its share of boss safe spots, though I didn't rely on them much. Most bosses aren't too bad, except maybe the second to last one. Everything about the level design demands mastery of movement. Some segments demand surgical positioning, others call for methodical screen clearing. It's dense, it's demanding, but it's deeply rewarding. Like most IREM shooters, X-Multiply rewards perseverance. Learning the tentacles, finding your strategies, exploiting safe spots, it all adds up to a uniquely satisfying experience. X-Multiply is an exceptional game by any standard. It offers a distinct atmosphere, a mechanical twist with real depth, and a challenge that rewards skill and patience. Unfortunately, it never got the recognition it deserved, and honestly, that might have been by design. Between IREM's radio silence, lack of media support, and near-zero marketing, it was almost doomed to obscurity. Well, not completely. It did get a console port in 1998, nearly a decade late, on PlayStation and Saturn via arcade gears. A solid release, though not without flaws. The PS1 version's resolution is clearly a compromise. It doesn't ruin the experience, but it does make it harder to enjoy than the version found in the more recent IREM collection.